Hi, folks. We should now be broadcasting. Let me take a look at what we got going on over here. Looks like there are people who are in attendance. Cool. I am going to pass the mic over to one of the other panelists in just a moment while I get our Facebook live stream set up. But hello, I'm Adonia Lugo, one of the core members of the Untokening Collective, and I am the host of today's webinar from beautiful Los Angeles, California. And I am joined by, well, right now there's four, soon there's going to be a fifth wonderful human who is going to be joining me today. I've got Naomi Dorner. And you guys want to just wave, yeah, when you're called on. Naomi Dorner, who is in Seattle. We've got Do Lee, who is in New York. Sarah Suleiman, who is also in Los Angeles. And Sarah McCullough, who is up in Davis or somewhere near Davis. And I'm going to go ahead and pass things over to Naomi to talk about housekeeping while I get our Facebook live stream set up.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, we're going to have a great conversation, but a couple of housekeeping notes for you. There is, in your taskbar, for those of you who have not used Zoom, a screen that obviously will have our faces, but then you can also expand or make that screen smaller by clicking a little box that basically looks like a screen. And that would allow you to see the screen shares that Adonia and Adonia will be sharing with you. Additionally, there's a panel where you can ask questions or leave comments. We would love for you to use that interactively. We are going to answer questions that come in at the end because we do have a bit of a discussion that we want to have prior. And I believe that is pretty much the extent. We may or may not have a poll. We will figure that out. If not, we will have a survey that we can send out afterwards because we do want to get some more specific input from you. So thank you. I think that's it. If I missed anything, feel free to cover that, Adonia.
I think that's good. So yeah, this is our first time trying this out, seeing how the interactivity works. We are just going to be doing text Q&A this time around, but we hope to, in some future Untokening webinars, get into the really cool stuff that Zoom can do, where you can see like participants' faces and all that kind of stuff. So let's get started with introductions. I think I will go last because I'm continuing to work on getting the Facebook live stream set up. So Naomi, if you want to introduce yourself, and then we can just kind of go in a circle.
Sure. Hi, my name is Naomi Dorner, and I am going to be very precise. I'm here participating today as one of the Untokening Collective members, as well as somebody who's been working within the mobility justice community, both locally at various points and also nationally. I do currently also work for the city of Seattle, but I am not speaking on behalf of the city of Seattle today. I just want to make that very clear. Thanks. And I'll throw it over to Sarah.
Hi, my name is Sarah Suleiman, and I write for Los Angeles Streets blog. I cover two historically disenfranchised communities, South Central and Boyle Heights, and was fortunate enough to be brought into the Untokening Collective just before the first event now a year and a half ago, and am thrilled to be sharing what we learned from everybody that first time. Oh, Carolyn's here.
Hello.
I can't hear anything.
Yes, we were being quiet. Can you hear us now, Carolyn?
Okay. Yes, now I can.
Thanks. Okay, cool. I think I have the Facebook live stream set up. It appears to be working. So we should be broadcasting to people through there as well, because our capacity for Zoom is 100. So hopefully we've made it clear enough to folks that they can be watching on Facebook. Welcome, Carolyn Chepansky from the Twin Cities. We are doing our introductions. So Sarah, you were in the midst of your introduction, right?
Oh, I'm done.
You're done. Okay. Carolyn, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Carolyn Shapansky. I, as Adonia said, live here in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. Have been involved in the Untokening since before its inception, I guess. And now I actually work professionally in affordable housing. So really interesting to see kind of the intersections in a lot of the conversations around equity in transportation and equity in housing. So that is why I'm late, because I had a work meeting. So yeah.
Okay, I'll go next, I guess. My name is Do Lee. I helped out with some of the advisory work before the first Untokening. I'm a PhD candidate in environmental psychology at the City University of New York, and I'm a team member at the Biking Public Project, and we work around equity and justice in cycling in New York City, and we've been focusing on issues around immigrant food delivery cyclists, and particularly around the electric bikes issue recently.
Hi, my name is Sarah McCullough, and I helped with programming for the first Untokening and the second, although unfortunately I was unable to attend the second event in California recently. I came into this work because I've been collaborating with Adonia on a BC Cultures project for quite some time now. My background is I'm a cultural researcher, and I currently work for UC Davis, running the Feminist Research Institute, and am currently see my role as trying to find ways to change research agendas that can address issues raised by people who've been attending the Untokening.
Great, thanks everyone. Now I'll do my introduction. So I'm Dr. Adonia Lugo. I'm an anthropologist and mobility justice strategist is what it now says in my email signature. So I'm like, yeah, I gotta use that phraseology more. I have been looking as a researcher and then as an advocate for about 10 years now, looking at the cultural distinctions of transportation. What are some of the cultural barriers and opportunities around moving more people toward sustainable and healthy transportation in U.S. cities? I am happy to be one of the co-founders of the Untokening project. I'm also the moderator of the Bike Equity Network email list. And I have a book that's going to be coming out later this year on these kind of bike equity topics called Bicycle Race. Transportation, Culture, and Resistance. That'll be coming out from Microcosm Publishing. And we are really excited to be working on creating a virtual meeting space to kind of keep our Untokening community in contact between our annual convenings that we've had for 2 years in a row now. So as we said earlier, you know, this is our first attempt. We'll see what works and what we can tweak, and what we're going to do at the end of this webinar, once we've presented our documents and done our discussion and done Q&A, is see if we can elicit some feedback from our participants around topics you'd be interested in for future webinars, and share some of the ideas we have for what we're going to be doing in 2018. So now that we have done our introduction, I would like to hand things over to Naomi to give us a little bit of background on the Untokening and where we came from.
Sure. So thank you so much, Adonia. The Untokening is a really interesting arrival, right? We, when I say we, the folks on this call, and then a number of other advocates working within both institutions and at mainstream advocacy organizations, and also just like as, you know, independent like activists, all mostly people of color or allies who really were at the forefront of thinking about not just equity, but like justice in communities, were, you know, having conversations oftentimes at some of these more mainstream conferences around walking, biking, and transportation, but not really finding the spaces that we kind of needed to carve out. It was either like there was one panel on a topic, equity largely, but confined to an hour and a half, and just never was quite enough, right? Because we were all folks who were constantly working and thinking on these issues, and a number of us went on to work in the national advocacy space, and have done a lot of writing, like Sarah and Carolyn. So I think there was just this moment where we found ourselves thinking, rather than seeking these spaces, why not create the conversations and the space and the strategies together. So that was really, I guess, the origin for how we came to creating the space, the Untokening. We'd all been kind of pushing at the margins in the mainstream and realized there was no need to do that anymore, that we were and could be the leaders that we were seeking. So I guess I'll leave it there in terms of the Untokening. I know we'll expand on a little bit more of like what that is for people who haven't been able to experience it. And then I do want to just set a little bit of a stage for the principles. The reason that we decided to have the first Untokening, which was in November of 2016 now, in Atlanta, right after the Facing Race conference that took place there, we wanted to get folks together in a room from around the country to discuss what are the key themes. I mean, we all had been having these conversations, but what were some shared principles? What were some shared themes that we were organizing around, that we needed some additional strategies and that we wanted to move forward together? And so that was really the impetus. That was the setting of the stage for November 13th of 2016. And so out of that came a lot of notes, a lot of discussion, and what then became a process for kind of getting to where we are today. And I'll leave it at that because I think Adonia is going to walk us through, sort of the how we created it. One thing I will say, and you'll probably hear this throughout, we've really come to learn that the Untokening collective and the space that we've created is a learning space. It's a healing space for us leaders of color and for people who've been working on mobility justice and take on the toll, a lot of times, the emotional labor and toll of doing this work, because we are tokenized often. And we often are putting ourselves in those positions as well. That said, we need to heal to do the work. So that's part of what our intent is. And then there's the strategy, right? So healing, but then working together to identify, like, what are we doing? How are we doing it? How can we learn from one another and move a mobility justice agenda forward? So thank you.
Thanks, Naomi. All right, so talking just a little bit about the process here, I'm realizing that something I could have mentioned earlier is that the reason we're having this webinar is because we have recently released 2 different sets of materials as the Untokening. One is Untokening 1.0, the Principles of Mobility Justice, which those of us who attended Untokening California were really lucky to get some printed copies of these, thanks to Carolyn. And we also just released more recently another different version based on the same source material of these principles called Untokening Beyond, oh my gosh, I don't have the title in front of me. I had just set it up so I wouldn't forget the title. Okay, here it is. Untokening Mobility Beyond Pavement, Paint, and Place. So we wanted to have this webinar not just to introduce people to these different documents, but also to explain a little bit of the process behind creating them. So in November 2016, we had our first Untokening convening in Atlanta, and our goal and one thing that we did a lot of prep work to achieve for that convening was getting people ready to join us in a space where we were going to share a lot of concerns, ongoing issues, problems, priorities that people had. We just wanted to be kind of like a giant ear to just capture, you know, what were all the conversations that folks were having who wanted to be part of this untokening space. And so we had a really successful model that we employed where we did basically like a day of group discussion, and people were able to kind of flow between tables and topics at various points and chime in. Some people chose to stay in the same conversation for a good chunk of the day. Others were kind of getting up and moving around. And at each of those tables, someone was willing to take notes on what discussion was happening. And so at the end of the day, we did a report back from, you know, what were the key takeaways from those discussions. And then we, as the organizing team, typed up all the notes and put them in one place. So by the end of 2016, we had this like monster, massive document that I think was about 20 pages long of just, you know, line after line of notes. And we organized this committee of folks who have experience with research and writing in various forms to just come up with some way of turning all that material into something, you know, kind of boiling it down or synthesizing common themes into something that folks could use to bolster their positions. Because one thing we've realized is that some of us are fortunate enough to be working in landscapes where we have some local support. You know, we have peers who are people of color or are really good allies who recognize the struggles that we're facing with tokenism in active transportation. But a lot of us are isolated from those kinds of support networks, or working in you know, cities or towns where there just isn't that group of peers who's already out there. So we wanted to turn all of that collective thought from the first untokening into the sort of thing that, you know, would be useful if you're a planner, or you work for a city agency, or you're a community activist and you're going into these spaces where, you know, having a set of principles or some kind of document to back yourself up can really amplify the impact you have. We thought that would be pretty cool if we could create a resource like that. So so that was kind of the overarching goal from my perspective on why we were gathering all that info at the first untokening and what we wanted to create. But then it turns out that getting through a whole bunch of people's thoughts and ideas and turning them into something collective is not a straightforward process at all, especially when, you know, for us, I would say the really, really core purpose that we've had as a group, and what we try to support other people in moving forward as well, is this idea that we need to be listening to community members. We need to be hearing the needs and issues that people are facing on the ground. And so there's a real tension in how we've gone about this project between wanting to make something that can travel, that can back people up, while also recognizing that anything we make could very quickly get co-opted, very quickly get appropriated, could be turned into something that actually gets used to block the voices of the people that we're hoping to, you know, empower. So that's a lot of background on, you know, kind of our thought process, where we got the source material. And so from all of those notes back in 2016, so far we have created these two documents, the Untokening 1.0 Principles of Mobility Justice. And then this second document, which I'll get into in a little bit, is actually I'll go ahead and just share screen now. So I'm going to hop back to Untokening 1.0 Principles of Mobility Justice real quick. So I have to remember how to share screen on Zoom. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. So if my co-panelists can verify for me that you guys are seeing the PDF now. Yes, cool. All right, let me try to get the PDF into a space where we can actually orient ourselves within the document. Okay, there's the first page. So we thought it might be good to go ahead and highlight a few of the principles from this document that we think, you know, best kind of summarize what we were trying to convey, or that have a just like special impact from the perspective of our panelists. So I want to go ahead and just turn it over to panelists to see if you guys want me to navigate to any particular spot in here. I know we wanted to start with the first three, was it? I'm going to go to the first one here. Okay, so this first statement that was included within this document, which again, many thanks to Carolyn for synthesizing all of the text into this very visual format that she put together. The big takeaway from this first one is that we seek to repair harm, not erase history. If we're moving toward mobility justice, we're seeking to repair harm. We're not trying to do away with a past that is still very real for lots of people. So for each of these principles, we have what is the just like biggest message, and then a little bit of discussion about some more detail that we're going into with these. I don't think I'm going to read everything from the page, so I want to see if anybody on the panel has anything they want to say about this principle. Go ahead and just begin speaking.
This one for me is one of the most important, or one that I come up against so much, because here in Los Angeles, we're coming up with the issue, coming up against gentrification so often. And so much of the discussion around it is so ahistorical. And because we aren't necessarily looking at that history and really understanding sort of what the racist origins of the policies of segregation were, and what that wrought within Los Angeles, why we have communities that are disenfranchised and what the effects have been, then what we have is people pushing policies that that perpetuate so many of those harms. And not only that, then those folks that are concerned about gentrification or about displacement are being blamed and labeled as NIMBYs, or their reasoning, their concerns, their fears are being misconstrued completely and dismissed out of hand. And so this for me is one of those core ideas where we really have to take a step back and recognize what that landscape is and how it came to be before we figure out where we're going to go with it.
Okay, I'm going to move on to our next one. Thank you, Sarah, for fleshing out the ideas there. So this next one, which I think in this one, the kind of core message is in the orange box, and then the discussion is in the bigger box. So to get to mobility justice, we seek to understand how oppressed communities have survived and thrived in spite of systemic neglect, and how these most vulnerable populations continue to struggle because of structural inequalities. Does anybody have fleshing out they'd like to do for this one?
On a structural note, so this is kind of like the corollary explanation of the first one. So the two, it's like two go together.
Oh, I see.
FYI. Yeah, so this is kind of like the fleshing out of the seek to repair harm, not erase history. So.
Well, it's a good thing we have the person who did the layout of these principles with us today. Awesome. So is that how it is throughout the whole document?
Yep. So if
Okay.
you have the printed version, it's basically the same card, front and back.
I see.
Each
Yes.
represents a principle. So.
Right. So like for this one, we've got the first part and then the second part here. Yeah, I guess I didn't pick up on that because I had been looking at the printed version, which makes that more obvious. Wonderful. Thanks for that, Carolyn.
Yep.
So actually, the next one then would be identity influences vulnerability. And safety is more than protection from cars, which is something that is a super core focus for the Untokening group, is expanding, what counts as street safety? What are the other forms of vulnerability that people are experiencing that go beyond being safe from aggressive drivers or violence that happens with cars? There's other ways that people are vulnerable in the street. Doe, do you have something you wanted to share on this particular principle?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the key things here is identity often informs who we as a society consider a threat, who are we designing safety for, and who are we designing safety from. And we see this a lot in New York, particularly in our work, where there's often with the immigrant food delivery cyclists, there's no data at all to suggest that they are a problem in terms of public safety, but there are incredible numbers of complaints, and so it's just when you kind of dig underneath those kind of complaints, it's who it raises the question about who has the power to determine safety, and so and I think this really gets at we really have to address kind of the roots of this and really understand that identity plays a big factor. Who has a voice at the table, and that it's not just simply safety from like cars or what have you, or but that we're talking about different kinds of vulnerabilities based on the person that you are.
Yeah, a lot of times we talk about, we almost, like, people think about bikes almost as if they're sort of neutral, where instead of, we're planning for the vehicle itself as opposed to the body that's on that bike, and all the things that Doe was talking about with regard to what kind of things are imposed upon that body, all the assumptions that are made about that person that's traveling through that space, and all the policies that are, like you said, set up to either protect us from that person or that have made assumptions about that person, whatever. All those impact that person's ability to access the public space.
Yeah, I think this one really gets to the core of so much of what we heard at the Untokening, the first one and even the second one. And I think it will just continue to be key, because it really is moving beyond, right, like the public right of way. It's moving beyond the pavement. It's about people and the bodies, and that how people present, and the biases, both implicit and explicit, in our like community and inherent in enforcement and policies are really, they really determine like the level of vulnerability that people have. So this one is key to mobility justice.
Great, thank you guys. I'm going to go ahead and move on to this next principle, and then we'll share a little insight into this, and then we'll hop over to the other document so we can start doing our go round and then move into Q&A. So this one, the third one in the set, makes the point that we need to prioritize people over profit, property, or placemaking. Prioritize people. Anybody want to expand on that?
I mean, I will say that, especially coming from the housing world, we are still stuck in this capitalist mindset that a solution only works if it works for the market. And I think that's such a huge barrier that we all run up against is, is this going to be financially feasible for the certain people that have always kind of been making the profit in the first place? So I think it's a real paradigm shift for a lot of people. I mean, even in the affordable housing space, there's a certain level of kind of capitalist gain that needs to be reached in order for a solution to be considered feasible. So I think really trying to flip that paradigm to think about the people in the neighborhood and who are the benefits going to accrue to, and making that forefront of any sort of conversation is so important, as opposed to kind of bringing in the public commentary and bringing in the community input after the fact. And I think this is a huge challenge for most public policy conversations, for sure, in terms of kind of the white supremacist systems that we operate under, as what solutions could be considered feasible.
I think too, it's also just picking up on that and then tying it back to some of the first couple of principles that we were speaking about, that this question of placemaking and what makes a place and who makes a place. When we're talking about historically disenfranchised communities or communities of color that have been shut out of the process, at least here in Los Angeles, what I have seen is that because of repressive policing, because of disenfranchisement, because of disinvestment, we have community that was built in private spaces. And so an absence of people gathering in the street or whatever, that's viewed as a lack of community, where actually community might be very, very strong, intense, and very tightly networked. But because it's not visible in the way that planners might expect to see it in their understanding of what placemaking is and what it looks like, we're missing those opportunities, as well as Carolyn was talking about with regard to engagement and understanding what makes a place. So it's a whole bunch of all of these things sort of tied together. We lost Carolyn, by the way. Where'd her beautiful face go?
Oh, let's see.
I see Carolyn.
Oh, I don't.
You mean Doe?
Yeah, I don't see Doe anymore.
Oh,
I see Doe.
Or like the Brady Bunch. I wanted to say about this because it came up actually in the last Untokening as a real key area of focus for mobility justice kind of going forward. I think it's really important that as we see the shift, like a paradigm shift in terms of transportation mobility services kind of becoming privatized, and that entire shift, like kind of being really about profit for the companies that are entering these markets. It's really going to be incumbent upon us, wherever we sit, to push for this prioritization of people, because it won't happen, to Karen's point, with the market forces like at play. So it really, I think, will continue to be something that is not just critical, but like that we have to be really vigilant about, because it won't. Corporations are not people, right? And so we need to make sure that we're at the forefront of pushing the prioritization, because the profits are there.
The one thing I would just add to really not just this principle, but the preceding as well, is that all of these issues resonate within the research on transportation and mobility as well. A version of how this plays in transportation is prioritization of what's fundable, prioritization of what knowledge is more easy to what data is easier to gather. And so in all of this, I also see these principles as really grounding and turning to the research community and thinking about how we can change what counts as knowledge, and what counts in helping us, and therefore what counts as data in helping us to make different types of decisions and move in different directions.
Great. Thank you guys for all of those insights. So I'm going to stop sharing this document and move into sharing the other one real quick. But one thing I wanted to echo from what Naomi was saying is that, when you have a network of people who have gotten to know each other over the years, like our network with the Untokening, there's like a lot of different ways that we come together, or shared interests or shared issues that we're dealing with, shared tensions, stuff like that. And so since we started calling this thing the Untokening almost 2 years ago now, we have worked on honing in, well, what is it that we can really add to this landscape, and what can we do that isn't being done? And as we have ongoing conversations about that, one thing we've recognized is that it is somewhat unique that we are not tied to any industry. We're not tied to, the bike industry or the shared mobility industry, even though lots of people in our network work in those spaces. We're not solely government. We're not solely nonprofits. We kind of cut across a lot of different sectors. And so I really liked what you were saying, Naomi, about the need for remembering that, we get to be working to strengthen, the narrative of what is happening in communities that might be kind of obvious to those of us who do observational work, but that just isn't making it to the level of priorities with industries, which are the places where there's a lot of resources or people who know how to hook up resource channels in place. So with that comment, I want to move into sharing this other document, which I'm just going to talk about real quick, not go in depth at all. So this narrative, Untokening Mobility Beyond Pavement, Paint, and Place, which I think I have neglected to share as a screen, and I will now remedy that. Okay, here we go. Yeah, there we go. Share screen. Cool. You guys can see the PDF now? Awesome. So with all that source material that led to the creation of the Principles 1.0 project, I had a thought last spring around, what if we just threw out the need to make it into something like principles and instead created something that was more like a narrative. And if any of those who are listening in are professional writers or do a lot of work with reports and things like that, that sometimes it can be so freeing to just go, you know what, I don't have to make this into a toolkit sounding thing. I don't have to make this into something that's going to speak to funders. I'm just going to write something, and I'm going to try and, convey the sense of mission. And so that's what this document is. So I'm the lead author on this narrative here, but because I was using material that had been worked on by Doe and Sarah and Naomi and Carolyn and Sarah, all of their voices are also contained within this document. But because I'm the lead author here, the usual caveat goes that anything that's wrong is on me. And I'm very grateful to Carolyn for the graphic design work that she contributed to this, as she has done with a lot of our Untokening work. So in the interest of time, because we're all interested in getting to more of a discussion, I'm just going to kind of stop there with that document. But both of these are available on our website, untokening.org, and you can do a download of the PDFs or share from there. So,
you want to mention the connection between the two, or did you? And I just
I think this would be a perfect time to go into more of our go round, because I think it'd be really great for folks to hear from the different panelists about, at the meta level, we created these documents. What are the connections? What are the things that we'd like to do differently in the future? What does this not encompass? Stuff like that. So Sarah, if you could get us started, that'd be great.
Damn it, I shouldn't have said anything. When we were putting all of these together, it was a real struggle to figure out how to present them in a way, how to distill all of it, how to even deciding who the audience was going to be, what they needed to know to be able to understand where we were coming from. And so the principles that were distilled into this are sort of the calling card, I guess you could say, that some of the core things, I think, that so many, the values that so many of us share that we want to put forth in our work. But for a lot of folks, it's sort of how do you get to that? How do you get to this position, or how do you get to these values, or why are these so important? And so the document that Adonia had put together helps explain some of that, where all of these ideas come from, why they're so important. And it's a living document. It's one that we assume will continue to evolve as the work evolves, as we evolve, as cities evolve. But hopefully it offers up some sort of template or some sort of jumping off point for folks that feel like that are having these discussions in their own communities. I'm really bad at doing this. You shouldn't have started with me, for sure. Go to someone more articulate.
I didn't mean to put the pressure on. I thought you were just like ready to go in. Anyone else who wants to jump in, feel free. Just ignore Sarah. Pretend like she's not there.
Go ahead. I'm like literally hearing birds chirping right now.
I hear it too.
Okay.
Sarah, that's my window. I can close it.
No,
it's
that's
wonderful.
awesome.
Like, am I going crazy right now? I don't know. No, I'll be really quick, but I think that we're having some conversations in the Twin Cities about things like Vision Zero, and I think that the principles have been really helpful in showing that there's consensus in certain communities around certain things, like policing not being a solution for street safety, around prioritizing people. And I think having the principles has been a way to say, no, the way you're thinking is not how everyone thinks. It's not normative and universal. And here's some kind of backing from folks around the country that share our beliefs, and we're not some radical fringe. So I think that the principles have been really helpful in that regard, in kind of providing some critical mass behind ideas that in most kind of mainstream conversations are still considered pretty radical. And this shows that no, they're not. They're widely held beliefs beyond just our community, or beyond the three people that you're pointing to as having those opinions. So I think it's been really helpful, and it's been definitely in circulation here in the Twin Cities in that regard.
So I'll very briefly add to that. I think that part of the principles are really like one piece of what was a very long process. And I think Adonia already alluded to this, but the fact that we could bring people together from around the country, not once, but twice, and that there's a desire to continue these conversations via, webinars, and we'll get into other ways that could happen, is just, it's part of this process. It's part of this national conversation, international, really. And I think, again, this is a baseline for some shared themes and principles. It is not to be supplanted, right? Because we came to this through a process, and it is really important that I think one of the biggest impacts for me has been that you cannot use these to define like what it means in your community. It is only through conversation, it is only through relationship building, it is only through trust that you can actually arrive to a place where you come to shared principles, right? And then from there's a whole paradigm that's possible. And I feel like that to me is probably the most important part of this work. There's disagreement, there will be, fraught tensions when this happens, but ultimately all of that is necessary to kind of arrive to a baseline. And so this is, this process and this kind of experiment that we've been a part of, which is ongoing, continues to evolve. And we've now come to a place where we've got baseline, agreement as to what at least foundationally we're working towards, that we can then build upon. And I think that process, for people who've been a part of it, can take that to their local communities and actually do untokening work in their community, which is, to me, the power of this work.
I'll have a few words. For me, I think attending the Untokening and participating in this document was extremely healing. And we've talked about that as a healing space. And I think that is one of the consequences from this legacy of trauma that we're talking about, this collective trauma, this feeling and experience of being tokenized. At least for me, what I feel is that that kind of experience, that traumatizing experience, has me feeling like I cannot trust myself, that I cannot trust my body, that that what I see and feel and understand about the world is not real. And so, it's like when we started this work in New York City around immigrant food delivery cyclists, and we were like, why is no one seeing what we're seeing? And it makes you kind of feel a little bit crazy, like you're all alone. And so I think one of the biggest things about doing Untokening was coming to a space where you realize that you're not alone, that this is real, that what I'm experiencing as a person is 100% real, and that I can trust my body, I can trust myself, that we can trust each other and build that support. And I think for me, that has been one of the most substantially healing aspects of being part of this process. And one of the things in my research that I'm finding is that when you're trying to address collective trauma, you got to collectively name what is your collective trauma. That's maybe the first step. And I think for me, that's what the Untokening has been like for so far. Obviously, there's further steps. We need to get our traumas collectively recognized, and we need to change structure. But I think this has been a tremendously important first step on a personal level. And from what I've heard from other people, I think that kind of feeling not alone has been so important.
And to kind of build on what Joe was saying, I already knew this, but this process has really drawn out for me what a huge, huge, huge gap there is in existing research. A related project, I'm undertaking a review of sociocultural research right now in biking and transportation, and everything that is talked about, or so much of what is talked about in the Untokening documents, is so absent. And to me, I think that speaks to those next steps. Like after naming, one step is recognition. And so part of the process of my process in this was is now thinking about how can we engage in what are the risks, and how can we thoughtfully engage in legitimizing strategies, and how can we do that thoughtfully that protects this knowledge, that that prevents co-optation as much as is possible, while simultaneously really establishing a clear voice, establishing a clear sense of reality that is currently not acknowledged by many.
And just picking up on that as well is I think one of the frustrations that I think a lot of us come up against, I know that I get hit with it so often, is that I'm accused of not having solutions, that I'm just, because I do so much deconstruction to get to like these things that I think for a lot of us are very basic truths, very basic values, and to have to show people that, to say, no, that there is this alternative reality. There are these people that have this completely different perspective and different set of experiences than the mainstream way that we approach planning, the way that we think about it, the values that are inherent there within. And what you're talking about, Sarah, with regard to the lack of data, is because we've been sort of shut out of that paradigm. Unless your values and are based in sort of these other realities, that you're not seeing that need for that data, or understanding what that data could be, what it could look like, who's missing from that conversation, how they're missing, and why that matters. So for me, that in this regard, this has been important as well, because it's just sort of like, and I think Adonia, you've been one that has said this quite a bit, is that there's this accusation, and you've said, give us that time to build that paradigm that everyone else, that structure that's been in place for so long, we haven't had that time or that space or those resources. So to come at us with those questions, and I'm sorry if I'm putting words in your mouth, but I know that you've talked about that quite a bit. So for me, they're valuable in that regard, as well as Doe said, to just say, we're not crazy. Like, this is real, that there are these other realities and that they matter, and that they have a place in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. That is definitely something I noticed when I was working in Washington, D.C. starting at the end of 2013 on the equity initiative at the League of American Bicyclists. People that I was talking to at, bicycle organizations or just any organization, thought that since there was this equity initiative, that meant I would have like best practices ready to go, like, okay, just tell us the solutions and we'll maybe try them out. And I was like, how the heck would we know the answers already? We're still in the like trying to understand what the problem is part of things. And I think it's because I come from a research background that from my perspective, that's okay. Like, taking the time to understand the problem is a really important part of any sort of change process. And I think that, we have done some really good work in that direction with Untokening. And, the other side of it is like, there are no overarching solutions that aren't just, hey, you actually need to listen to people who are going through the stuff. The people who have, the problems are usually also the people who have the solutions. From a community resilience standpoint, this isn't about communities that have been, warped and don't have anything of value. That's not it at all. We just need to change the way that, depending on how you look, you're sometimes seen as more of an authority or less of an authority, even on the problems in your own life, which is wild, but that's the society we live in. So, we really, through the Untokening and a really strong message we're trying to send out through these written projects is that we think it's super important to take people seriously when they're telling you about a problem that they're facing. And we are taking the time to stay in that defining the problem space. And through that, I think we're going to get to some better solutions and, be able to empower people to present the solutions they already have. But the issue has been that they're not heard. So we have received a question through the Q&A, and since we are about 3 minutes out from ending here, let's go ahead and answer that question. So Susan Gleason asked, Carolyn, can you say more about how the principles were used to help identify consensus?
I guess in relation to what I'd said about what's going on here in the Twin Cities, I would say that we haven't reached consensus, and I think that the power of the principles is that it's made maybe more palatable or more credible some of the things that we were bringing to the table in a conversation that, when isolated here to the Twin Cities, seemed kind of crazy. So thinking about changing community engagement priorities to really prioritize people, or rethinking the notion that if we put more cops on the streets and we ticket more people, that, we're somehow inexorably going to be safer. I think it's just been an opportunity to show that there's been some consensus in other communities that are not the normative, white hetero planner dude at the city. And it's kind of introduced that as a credible part of the conversation. And I think that certainly hasn't kind of come full circle, but, the principles were a point of discussion at the, Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Group. There's been, conversations about Vision Zero where, these principles have come up. So I think it hasn't moved folks towards consensus, but I think it's been able to raise issues in ways that maybe wouldn't have had the weight without kind of something a little more tangible, but ongoing.
So I knew this was going to happen, that we were just going to like zip through an hour really quickly, having barely scratched the surface of talking about all this cool stuff. One thing I want to mention before we do a final round of thoughts and thank yous is that one thing we thought we'd be able to cram in here, but actually we don't have time for it, is starting to gather some ideas from people about topics that you could use some more information on, or like a panel discussion, or getting to participate in some kind of virtual meeting about. That's something we want to be doing as Untokening in 2018. We're also interested in starting to develop something like a leadership cohort within Untokening, because as it currently stands, there's a group of us who have been the core organizers of the first two conferences, but we want to figure out how to structure things so we can be bringing in more smart people and providing the kind of training that might be useful, such as facilitation training. It'd be great to get folks trained up in a kind of Untokening facilitation style. Does anybody else want to, is there anything I'm forgetting as keep your eye out for Untokening in 2018?
Yeah, we would love to find out who is planning to attend Policy Link, the Equity Summit in Chicago. We are thinking about, there are going to be some of us that are there, so we're thinking about having not a convening, not anything full scale like we'd had before, but like a social kind of gathering and a place for people who are in our community to get together while at Policy Link. And we want to do that kind of thing at equity and racial justice sort of focused events. And we encourage people in our community to think about, how they might want to organize folks at conferences they're going to that are related. So we can send out a survey, or I don't know, we'll follow up on getting input from people that are planning to be in Chicago for Policy Link's Equity Summit.
And can I just give a shout out for, if you want to sign up for our email list, that's on our website, untokening.org. And we also have a Facebook, facebook.com/untokening, and Twitter handle @untokening. There's a trend. And that's a good way to kind of keep in touch with us too, as we're kind of pulling together groups for various convenings and stuff.
Great. Any final thoughts anybody wants to share on these docs, or anything you've got coming up that you want to mention to the audience before we wrap up? Okie dokie. Well, thank you very much, Sarah, Carolyn, Naomi, Doe, and Sarah, for joining us today to talk through these different principles projects. We are going to be getting the recording of this webinar up on untokening.org as a resource for folks. And thanks everybody for attending, and we hope to see you again soon. Have a great week and have a great Black History Month.